I have filed 11,000 labor contracts in my career, and I remember exactly one crew by name. That should tell you something, though it took me considerably longer to learn it than it should have. My name is Dorun Yell, and I am Threnn, which translates, if you want the polite version, roughly as one who counts. We are very good at it. By some reckonings, it is the only thing we are good at. Though I would not have said so out loud before this rotation, and I am still not entirely comfortable saying it now. The humans came through Cargo Bay 7 on a standard 6-month rotation. 4 of them contracted to handle manual freight movement during the high-density transfer windows when our automated couplers were busy elsewhere. I processed the paperwork myself. Class Theta manual labor, minimal cognitive load anticipated. It is a real classification. I did not invent it. I simply applied it, the way I had applied it to every human crew that had passed through the bay in the last 40 cycles. They used hooks. Actual hooks, on chains, slung over their shoulders like a costume from one of our historical dramas about the era before lifting fields. They walked the containers into position with hand signals. A fist meant stop. A flat palm meant ease off. 2 fingers meant something I never did learn. My underclerks found this delightful. They would gather at the rail above the bay floor on their breaks, specifically to watch, the way you might watch an animal solve a simple puzzle for a reward. They are very dedicated to their hooks, said Senior Clerk Ressa. The first week, not unkindly. She meant it as a kind of compliment, the way you compliment a child's drawing. I logged her comment in my personal notes, because that is the sort of administrator I am, and because I assumed, with the full confidence of 40 cycles of precedent, that there would be nothing more interesting to log. A visiting compliance officer from the Central Registry toured the bay in the second week, the way they do twice a cycle, walking the floor with a slate and a faintly pained expression he reserved for anything that did not interface electronically with his slate. He watched the humans walk a container the length of 3 berths using nothing but hand signals and their own feet, then turned to me and asked, with real concern, whether the contract included hazard pay for working without instrumentation. I told him it did not, because the instrumentation was unnecessary. He wrote something down that I am fairly certain was not flattering, filed his own report, and left. I remember thinking, at the time, that I agreed with whatever he had written. The crew chief was a woman named Reyes. She did not introduce herself. She simply showed up on the first shift, checked the manifest against the actual containers, which did not match, a discrepancy our own system had not flagged, corrected it in handwriting on a printed sheet, and got to work. I noted the discrepancy in her favor, and the handwriting against her, because handwriting suggested a system too primitive to interface electronically with ours, and I filed that observation too. For 3 months, nothing happened that I considered worth recording. The crew moved freight. The freight moved on schedule. My underclerks grew bored of watching the hooks, and moved on to other amusements. I assumed the contract would close out the way all of them did, with a satisfactory rating and a renewal form nobody read closely. Then the primary grav coupler on line 4 seized during a live transfer, with a 40-ton container half extended over the floor, and 2 of my own engineering staff still inside the access crawl beneath it. The warning chime that should have sounded across the bay sounded instead, for reasons the after-action review never fully resolved, only in my own office, 3 corridors away, on a feed I happened to glance at while filing an unrelated form. By the time I reached the floor, the lifting field was holding at 60% of rated load and dropping in small, uneven increments, the kind of failure our engineers describe as creeping, and treat with the particular dread reserved for problems that refuse to announce themselves all at once. The bay's own engineering crew stood at the consoles doing exactly what their training told them to do, which was wait for the diagnostic suite to agree with them before touching anything. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I have read the incident report 11 times since, and each time I am struck by how little of it required anything from me. The coupler's diagnostic suite returned a fault code that matched nothing in the registry. Not unheard of, but it meant the automated recovery protocol would not engage, because automated recovery protocols in our bureaucracy require a matched fault code before they are permitted to act. I want you to understand that this is not a failure of imagination. It is policy. A system without a defined fault cannot be trusted to define its own response. I have defended this policy in 3 separate review hearings. I would defend it again, probably, given time to think about it somewhere quiet. There was no time to think about it somewhere quiet. The 2 engineers in the crawl space had perhaps 11 minutes before the container's secondary clamps lost integrity, and the requisition for manual override authority, the form that would let anyone touch the coupler without waiting for the diagnostic suite to catch up, was sitting in my queue, correctly formatted, awaiting my signature, 3 approvals away from being legally actionable. Reyes did not wait for the form. She walked the length of the coupler rig with her hand flat against the housing, the way you might check a fevered child's forehead, and she told her crew, in a voice I distinctly remember as not raised even slightly, that the secondary truss had torqued out of true on the starboard side, and the fault code meant nothing, because the sensor reading it was mounted on the wrong arm of the assembly. I checked this afterward against the engineering schematics. She was right down to the centimeter. She had never seen those schematics. She had simply looked at where the housing had warped and the load had shifted, and read it the way our own engineers read a diagnostic screen, except she was reading the actual machine instead of a number describing the machine. Her crew had the coupler stripped to the secondary truss with their hooks and chains, and a tool I am told is called a breaker bar, before my requisition form cleared its second approval. They did not ask permission. They did not check with me. One of them, I never learned which, climbed inside the housing itself, which our safety protocols forbid without a minimum of 4 clearances, and physically levered the truss back into alignment, while the other 3 held the load steady by hand against 40 tons of container that our own lifting field, for reasons still under review, had failed to fully release. It held. The container settled. The engineers climbed out of the crawl space unhurt, one of them so embarrassed he did not look at me for the remainder of the contract. My requisition form cleared its 3rd approval, 4 minutes after the problem it addressed no longer existed, and I filed it anyway, because that is the sort of administrator I am. Reyes wiped her hands on a rag, looked up at the rail where my underclerks had gathered, all of them this time, in complete silence, and said nothing at all. I felt the color come up along my throat plates, which among Threnn is not a thing you can stop once it starts, and which everyone on that rail would have correctly read as something between embarrassment and humility. Reyes did not appear to notice, or chose not to. She went back to the manifest. The discrepancy on container 41 was still wrong. She fixed that too. I revised her file the following morning. I want to tell you I revised it because of the coupler, but the truth is duller than that and more accurate. I revised it because I went back and reread her original handwritten correction from the first week, the one I had filed as evidence of a primitive interface, and I noticed for the first time that it had been right, and our system had been wrong, and she had simply fixed it without telling anyone she had done us a favor. Class Theta manual labor, minimal cognitive load anticipated, is still the official designation. I never managed to get it changed. The form for reclassification requires a justification narrative under 400 words, and I have tried 6 times to write one and failed every time, because the truth keeps running long. What I did instead, in the small space the bureaucracy allows for such things, was add a single line to her renewal contract under Notes, where almost nobody reads. It says the crew should be assigned to Cargo Bay 7 again by name, not by rotation, the next time the schedule allows it. Ressa asked me once why I bothered. I told her some animals turn out to be solving a harder puzzle than the one you assumed they were given, and the only mistake is assuming you were the one who said it. She did not understand the comment. I did not explain further. I went back to my forms, which for the first time in 40 cycles, I found I no longer entirely trusted.